Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 11 cheat sheet. If you've not watched the cheat sheet before, it's effectively a series where I rank all the positions in FPL by price and also by sort of my tier and my rating of an asset. This is based on a combination of my understanding of, let's say, managers and their preferences, what I've gleaned from fixtures and watching them, but also, taking a deep dive into analytical stats and also historical stats from previous seasons gone by. So starting with the cheat sheet in the midfield today, I would actually like to mention that there are actually quite a few changes that you'll see, for example, with Man City assets and Brentford assets. I've also made a video on free hit 18 strategy because there's going to be a blank game week where Brentford will be playing City and that game will be cancelled on game week 18 due to City's involvement in the Club World Cup. It's worth actually looking into whether you want to free hit 18 and whether your transfers, might be helped on by investing more into City or more into Brentford or actually completely avoiding them altogether, right? With the exception of, let's say, 1 to 2 picks that you'll keep and be able to bench on game week 18. Before we actually get into the midfielders, really and truly, would also like to shout out people who are already subscribed to the channel. However, still 50% of viewers, unfortunately, are still unsubscribed. If you do enjoy the advice and you do enjoy the cheat sheet series, do feel free to drop a subscription and even maybe click on the notification bell to not miss out on future videos, and also drop a like on the video as well. Now, heading towards midfielders, as we were saying, I do think Hwang Hee-chan actually gets a rise. It's a case of him being a great pick in replacement of Neto. Yes, of course, a lot of people will immediately say and make a good and fair point that Neto, of course, was the leading creator for this team. So how good can Hwang be as a pick? I do think if you just think about, let's say, Neto being such a key asset and someone who actually, was completely indisposable to the team, in theory, all the attackers from this Wolves team should benefit, right, from the byproduct of a minutes sort of point of view, right? Hwang is someone who at times was always an early sub, but his recent good performances have meant that he's gotten really good minutes so far. I think also Sarabia will come back into the team and he probably will sort of replace Neto. He might not be necessarily as creative as Neto, but we do know that Sarabia has historically posted very, very healthy numbers from an expected goals involvement point of view. So I do think that that's going to help bolster Hwang in Neto's absence, not to mention that Sheffield United away is just a perfect fixture to start with an enabling asset. So if you're looking for an enabler this week, I do think Hwang is one of choice. Gordon, of course, much more of a long-term asset. Same with Palmer, who unfortunately you can't really play due to 3 terrible fixtures in a row. Adingra, I think, is still fantastic and someone you can generally consider. Yes, of course, he was actually subbed off at 70 minutes versus Fulham, but you also have to take the context of how many minutes was he playing the previous fixtures. He played 90 in the Europa League, played 90 versus Liverpool, played 90 versus City. So it's clearly not the case that he suddenly stopped being an important player. I just think it's a case where he also himself needs some rest, right? Just like, for example, Mitoma needed 45 minutes of rest versus Bournemouth. As far as the 6.x position, the one change I've actually made is to actually give Mbeumo a rise. I do think the reality is that he is still just an insane monster pick, and he has West Ham at home, which is actually a very good fixture. We know that this West Ham team have been bottom half in terms of defense, and there's no real sort of expectation here that West Ham will be able to shut out Brentford easily. They've been a top 5, top 6 XG team so far, and Mbeumo, of course, being the only penalty taker in this price bracket, maybe with the exception to Gross, who have added, but I'll talk about him in a second, just means that he is that lucrative of a pick, even though he's going to be playing some tough fixtures like Liverpool away and Arsenal at home. We know that in this sort of 3-5-2, when they play versus some of these tougher teams, he also gets to play up top, which has, of course, been the big shift away from his sort of right wing back role, which we've seen as of weeks late when he was sort of blanking non-stop. And that just might mean that, of course, if you're, let's say, sick of owning some of the West Ham assets, like, for example, a Ward-Prowse, it could be the time to just move into Mbeumo and just see him as someone who you would keep until really Game Week 21 when the AFCON happens and he will be sort of leaving the Premier League shortly. As far as, let's say, Gross, who have added onto the cheat sheet, I think he's a differential simply, someone who I wouldn't really consider too seriously, but of course he is cheaper than someone like his counterpart in Mitoma, and he might get penalties when, let's say, João Pedro's not on the pitch, which of course, will give him a percentage chance of being a good pick at various times, right, if he gets lucky. At the same time, we've seen Gross sort of play a variety of roles for this Brighton team, so you're sort of juggling between someone who could play fullback, could play center mid, and at times could even play at the 10 position, although that's been very rare under De Zerbi. So I do think that his underlying stats so far have been decent, but of course you can see that he is a bit more of a red pick, like, for example, Szoboszlai it was in weeks past, until, for example, his sort of explosion last week. So one to think about in terms of Gross, where if you need, let's say, a cost saving of some sort, I do think he's one to think about, but purely as a differential. As far as the 7.x price bracket, Szoboszlai obviously was someone that we dropped last week, but he put a good performance out. I still think he remains as a differential because there are fixtures where, look, I mean, how often are you going to get multiple kind of assists in a game? I think when you look at some of the tougher fixtures that Liverpool has played, he does play, of course, a very sort of tried and trusted center mid role, very different to sort of playing as the 10 that he was in Red Bull Leipzig. So I do think it's fair to say that Szoboszlai isn't the craziest high ceiling asset in FPL, but I also think that we sort of sometimes misjudge how effective someone can be if they're just playing for a good team and have consistent avenues to points. And that's something that Szoboszlai does have. He's also not scored some of his long range bangers that he does score from the international fixtures yet. And that's still going to eventually happen, right? Szoboszlai is going to have the stars align, and he's still going to be a good pick. And you would have bet that to happen when Liverpool have good fixtures, which they do have. So I can understand why Szoboszlai is someone who's interesting. But right now, of course, I think there's still better picks to go for. Foden is someone who rises, as I said, as a symptom of maybe considering Man City players more so for that sort of 3-hit 18 strategy line. You're starting here, of course, with a great Bournemouth fixture. The reality, of course, is that his underlying stats have been perfect this season, but also Foden is someone who's actually played much more minutes than we've ever really seen in years past because, of course, Mahrez leaving and also KDB's injury. So because of also Gundo leaving too, you're seeing Foden effectively be close to, let's say, an 85 or 80-minute player this season, which is incredible for a Man City player. So I do think Foden over this run is quite interesting. If you want to jump onto him and you have somehow a very weak midfielder that you want to get rid of this week, I do think Foden is an interesting sort of gambit. At the 8.x position, I have to sort of apologize. I do think I got it wrong in terms of dropping Maddison last week. I do think right now it's justified to actually maybe avoid Saka and to just simply, let's say, keep Maddison and Son in your team if you want to. I do think also it's very justifiable to just go Saka and Son as well if you can afford it. But there is a reality where some people will be hampered by a team value sort of perspective. And ultimately, you might have to just struggle with Maddison and Saka as opposed to, let's say, Son plus someone else. And even though I do think Son is a slightly better pick in terms of the team structure point of view of being able to own, let's say, someone who's amazing in FPL, if he continues to play in the central forward position in the Spurs team. The simple reality is you can always downgrade from Son, whereas you can't do that with any of the other picks here if you, let's say, wanted to move towards Son in the future. So that's something to think about. As far as, let's say, Odegaard, he does drop. He did play actually in the EFL Cup, and he did score in that fixture, a consolation goal versus West Ham. And of course, we know that he was rested in the Sheffield United game because Arteta saw it as an opportunity for him to rest with a sort of recurring injury, or not a recurring injury, but rather an injury that he's been carrying as of late, which is what he mentioned in his press conference. I do think it's a case where with Odegaard, unfortunately, with exception to, let's say, the penalties, once again, he's one of these sort of red cases this season where he's played enough minutes and his underlying stats are so poor for his sort of price point where I just am not really buying him as a pick to consider. Yes, of course, at times he'll get penalties, and it's maybe at Saka's discretion as to when he gets them. But given that some of these good fixtures are at home, and if you believe that sort of home and away theory, that probably would still benefit Saka as opposed to Odegaard, though I just think that he deserves a drop. Maybe he doesn't deserve to be at Marcus Rashford's level quite yet, but I think that these are both picks that I wouldn't really seriously consider for the short term, and for that reason, they're just differentials. In terms of the forward position, what we have here is a lot of changes in that sort of 5.x price bracket. And I know a lot of people will be thinking about, Edouard actually has fantastic fixtures, so why does he deserve to drop? And ultimately, I think one thing that we can point out with someone like Edouard immediately is just to mention that his underlying stats are actually one of the worst in this sort of bracket. And his minutes are also still not, for example, pure 90s, right? Players like Cunha will actually benefit from Neto's absence, and Ketty, of course, will benefit from Jesus' absence. Calvert-Lewin is continuing to actually post really, really good, consistent minutes, and he has better underlying stats. So from that point of view, and also with the uncertainty of whether Edouard actually has penalties or not, because Cunha could be on penalties, and Calvert-Lewin is definitely on penalties, and João Pedro's definitely on penalties. That is what makes me concerned about Edouard and his validity as a pick, as well as just simply the fact that Crystal Palace has been a very, very poor offensive team. Yes, of course, they mustered up some very, very nice attacks versus Spurs, but a lot of them really were coming from set pieces as well and sort of orchestrated plays. Of course, Anderson pinged a great ball towards Ayew, who scored that sort of handball goal, controversial or not. But I do think Edouard's just not getting enough service right now. And part of that is because, simple players and creative players like Eze and Olise are still out of the team. As far as João Pedro, I have given him a rise, and a lot of people might find this quite controversial. But I do think that this Brighton team is a very, very serious attacking team. I also am obviously heavily invested into the concept of owning penalty takers. He is actually at a ridiculous price point of 5.3. So, of course, that's a huge cost saving compared to actually anyone else in this price bracket. And ultimately, I do think he'll get the start versus Everton. Now, the question, of course, is whether he'll get the start for Sheffield United, because if he gets the start in the Europa League fixture after the Everton game, then, of course, missing the Sheffield United game will be awful. But I do think he'll just generally get at least 55 minutes per game if you average out over the next few weeks and you plan to look at, let's say, game weeks 11 to 13, which are just generally good fixtures for Brighton. And if you're prepared to, let's say, own João Pedro for this run of fixtures, then of course he's a great pick. Now, in terms of Nketiah and also even the ownership of João Pedro, I do think that you can just sort of look at, let's say, game week 12 as an opportunity to jump off of João Pedro if suddenly he just clocks in another 90-minute performance in the Europa League, right? If he plays that many minutes, then it's very, very unlikely that he'll play and even start in game week 12. So that's a simple, nice, elegant move towards Nketiah, who actually, of course, is bolstered by the fact that Jesus seems to be out at least until either early December, which would point towards after the international break, or mid-December, which would actually point towards getting an additional fixture, which would mean game week 14 as well for this Arsenal team. And if you look at obviously Arsenal's fixtures, it's kind of stop, start. And game week 14 is a good fixture. So if Nketiah actually gets the start in there, then of course his validity as a pick will increase. But I don't have enough confirmation of that. And also Arteta has not really expounded upon Jesus' injury and sort of timeline of absence. So I do think Nketiah is just unfortunately not a pick that I would consider this week, just because Newcastle is a bad fixture. All the other players in these sort of areas at least have a home fixture or a very, very good away fixture. So for example, Calvert-Lewin being a good example of that home fixture, where Everton, as we've been saying in recent weeks, have actually been a very, very consistent team. So no surprises that they actually managed to beat West Ham away from home. And I do expect Everton to actually post better performances so far and also post better results in terms of sort of their league standings, because from an underlying stats point of view, Everton have been really good. And actually Calvert-Lewin, of course, very good as well. So that's why you can see his XGI per 90, very, very healthy. And of course, a penalty taker as well. So I actually think Calvert-Lewin is actually probably one to think about, one to definitely consider maybe into the future, even as soon as this week. If you're, let's say, looking for a differential, I do think he's actually someone that I would actually prefer over Edouard, even though I've sort of put them in the same bracket. Cunha is someone who maybe I think just from a clinical finishing point of view, clearly is struggling. You can see that he's one of those sort of red-tiered assets in terms of his actual goal conversion, which shows, of course, that his finishing was very poor. Not to mention that, of course, his underlying stats have improved a lot from this season compared to last. And that might just point to, let's say, a little bit of outlying games, right, where Wolves have overperformed, or he has overperformed in terms of his underlying stats. One thing I will mention, of course, is Gary O'Neill last season was also doing the same thing with Bournemouth, where he actually leveled up the attack. So no surprise that some of the Wolves players like Hwang or like Cunha are actually enjoying better underlying stats this season. So if you do see it as an opportunity to jump on a player who actually has Sheffield United away, I do think Cunha is actually a nice pick to go into. Ferguson, for the same reason, where, as I said, if you average out some of these fixtures, he is a very, very good finisher. As you can see with the sort of goal conversion, something that João Pedro does struggle with clearly is finishing, but he also gets the sort of bonus of being a penalty taker. So I think Ferguson is a bit of a punt, but I think still at this price point, someone that I would definitely not mind moving into. For example, if I own Solanke and still wanted to invest into an asset around that price point, I don't really mind going to Ferguson. However, of course, I will also mention that João Pedro is sitting right there. And of course, a lot of the picks at the sort of 5.8 price point are still very, very good. And yeah, ultimately it's a case of whether you actually like this Brighton team, whether you're comfortable with owning an attacker who will only play maybe an average of 55 minutes per game. Is that good enough for you, or is it not? And if it's not, then I think definitely don't invest into someone like Ferguson. But sometimes there is a bit of upside in jumping into a player who, at this sort of price point is justified to play less than 90 minutes a game. Solanke falls just by virtue of game weeks 11 and 12 being bad. As far as the 7.x price point, a lot of changes here. Darwin, unfortunately, as we've mentioned all week long, does benefit from Luis Diaz and his sort of family circumstance. I won't talk about that anymore, but that's just a reality. He was rested in the EFL Cup fixture, then scored a screamer in the 30 minutes, but that's just one game sample size. The reality is that we've had 2 seasons of evidence so far to show that Darwin is an absolutely explosive pick when it comes to underlying stats, someone who actually, rivals some of the sort of absolute monsters in terms of Callum Wilson and Haaland in terms of goal conversion, and much rather in Darwin's case, sort of attacking position conversion, right? Because he always gets into really, really good positions to actually score. Unfortunately, of course, his finishing has left him down even this season and even last. So one thing, of course, with Darwin is that, with increased minutes, he's a very, very good pick. I still personally like Alvarez more. I think I like the Bournemouth fixture more. Just like, for example, Haaland, Salah captaincy, I'm more in the Haaland camp. I also sit, for example, a little bit more firmly within the Alvarez camp over Darwin over the next few fixtures. Not to mention, of course, that he will always struggle with, let's say, coming back after an international break and also maybe not getting a start. So that's something that does concern me. But of course, the reality too is that Game Week 13 is a tough fixture for both of them. It's a mirror matchup, and Game Week 12 arguably is better for Liverpool. So it really depends on balance. What do you think between Game Week 11 and 12? who's got a better fixture. Darwin's also a little bit more expensive, so that's something to think about. But yeah, anytime you can actually see someone who actually has ridiculous stats like this, I mean, yeah, you can only see that, for example, him, Haaland, and Wilson are the only players with XGI over 1. And no surprise that I see them as monsters in FPL, provided they have good minutes. And this is something that Wilson benefits from as well. I was interested to see whether Wilson, would continue to play in the EFL Cup. He was actually rested this week, came on at 64 minutes and actually just sort of jogged on really to sort of finalize and culminate that game versus United. Whereas United also brought on 3 starting players and actually managed to do really nothing with that. Wilson, of course, is someone who is very, very clinical, much more clinical than Darwin, for example, and is sort of at Haaland's level of being a clinical finisher. Maybe you can even argue being a slightly more informed finisher, at least when we consider the context of, let's say, let's say a rolling 6-month period. And ultimately, this Newcastle team are insanely good. The thing that I would say is that I'm a little bit more concerned about his minutes overall, because of course fitness is always an issue with Wilson. They will also have to compete on the front of the Champions League as well, so it's a case of, is he prioritized for certain fixtures, and hard to say which priority fixtures are there for Wilson, right? It might be the case that he gets rested in the Champions League and actually plays that Bournemouth fixture, which obviously would make him a better asset, but hard to tell ahead of time whether that would be the case. And of course, we've seen at times Joe Linton or Anthony Gordon sort of play those central positions whilst Wilson is off the pitch, and we know that Wilson can still be an early sub. So that's sort of the context. But I think obviously Wilson does just inherently benefit from Isaac being out. It's just a case of Newcastle's fixtures, unfortunately, not being the greatest. But I still think that he, at his price point, is still fantastic given the price drops he's had. And yeah, as I said, unfortunately, I just prefer Alvarez and Darwin for the time being. And Watkins, Haaland still reigns supreme. In terms of defender positions, I've added Lascelles. I mean, you just can't ignore him if Botman's actually out for a prolonged period of time. It's a no-brainer there, but of course, keep in mind, of course, Newcastle have bad fixtures. It's just a case where, for example, in Game Week 12, if you're struggling to put out a defender, he's quite good. Game Week 13, not so sure about, of course, Lascelles versus Chelsea, but at least it's a home fixture. And moving on towards the sort of 4.2 sort of plus players into the 4.9s, Maguire is a new player, Dalot is a fall, and Udogie is a fall as well. The reason is because I do think Spurs' fixtures are getting worse, so I do think Udogie is a fall. In the case of Udogie as well, it's just a case of, what's going on with his fitness. He has struggled at times to sort of keep up with the pace of some of the Premier League games in terms of being an early sub. So this is something that hasn't really happened to Porro, who since really assuming the starting position Game Week 2 has not really dealt with something like that. So I do think Porro is a fall. In terms of Dalot and Maguire, I think I also have to mention, even though Maguire seems to be at an absolute great price, and I've rated Dalot, as a pick, Wan-Bissaka's back, and we saw a Dalot 45-minute substitute in the EFL Cup fixture, so I would be quite surprised to see Dalot actually get the good minutes that we really want from a player that we're spending 4.9 on. So for that reason, he has to fall. And Maguire, I mean, it's 4.2 million. I mean, you can't really go wrong with it, but I am still concerned, of course, that they still have some center backs coming back from injury, and also they're shocking. They're just a shocking team, and how can you really rate this United team so far? You can't even say eye test, because a team like Chelsea have performed well from a defensive point of view from eye test, but from an analytical point of view, sorry. But United, they've failed on pretty much every categorical test that we can actually have to sort of rate teams. And that's reality. As far as sort of premium players, definitely Tsimikas and Guehi for me, the sort of priority transfers this week in terms of how good they are for the next few weeks, just in terms of great fixtures for Crystal Palace overall. And then obviously with Tsimikas' case, just exceptional fixtures with an attacking fullback. I mean, how can you really go wrong with that? As far as the 4.7 price point, where you have couple players in that tier 2 category, I've got Dean, Burn, and Gabriel. Gabriel obviously falls due to the rotation. I am concerned still, that he could get rested in the Burnley fixture just due to Champions League commitments. As far as Burn, I think with Lascelles sort of emerging, he sort of falls. As far as Dean, he is new, but I think we just do have to stay tracked and stay tuned into what is going on with Moreno's injury precisely, because of course that will have huge impacts on whether Dean is going to be a good pick going forwards. And of course, the general run for Aston Villa is starting to end. I do think that you can actually, for example, go Dean and sort of see him as, like, let's say a 2-week punt, because at that price point, you're not, for example, expending as much money as you would be if you were going towards cash. As far as the 5.x price point, no real significant changes here other than I've added Guardiola and Walker. This is more towards the sort of avenue of players who are actually looking towards a free at 18 strategy and actually looking for a defender this week specifically, where, of course, if you own Newcastle players, if you own Arsenal players, they don't have a good fixture this week. You sort of need some coverage of good fixtures, and maybe actually Guardiola and Walker could be your avenue towards that, right? Or if let's say you wanted to move out a Trippier, this could be the time to do so, and maybe you can save some funds, own a Man City asset for the time being. Cash and Porro both fall. I do think that we'll consistently see some falls from these players as the fixtures get worse and worse for both Tottenham and Aston Villa from a defensive point of view. And then actually in terms of, let's say, Trippier and Alexander-Arnold, both of them fall as well. I think we're starting to see, with a little bit more data this season, that Trent Alexander-Arnold's underlying stats are starting to drop. Trippier, of course, was someone who, of course, conversely actually rose, which is no surprise because Newcastle's attack as a whole has improved. And that obviously leads, for example, more avenues towards set pieces, more corner kicks, more free kicks for Trippier to benefit from. But the fixtures are getting worse, and at sort of 7.0, at that sort of price point, I do think Trippier is starting to be a little bit overpriced in terms of how essential he previously was thought to be, you know, over a very, very good fixture run. And that this is sort of the argument about whether someone, you know, stays essential forever. I don't think Trippier does. You're looking at a player who, of course, has tougher fixtures. He has price risen a lot. And ultimately, for example, if I was to be asked the question of whether I want to keep Son versus Trippier, I would answer Son. And that's why, for example, made my moves last week as I did, and that's that. As far as the goalkeepers, I've made a few changes in terms of adding Flecken and also increasing Ederson and giving him a rise. Keep in mind, of course, this is really if you're sort of prepared to reinvest into players like Ederson and Flecken as a result of free hit 18 being a general strategic choice. Johnstone gets a fall, and that's only just because I do think Raya is the standout keeper, and I just want to give Raya that sort of credit there, because I do think getting an Arsenal keeper is a bit of a steal at 4.8 compared to, let's say, some of the other leading keepers in terms of Flecken and Johnston. As far as the 5.x keepers, I still think that none of them are sort of priority to get. Yes, of course, maybe around the double game week, we'll be looking at Ederson because maybe we don't have the confidence in terms of Guardiola or Ruben Diaz's or even Stones or Walker's minutes. And so maybe we'll prefer going for Ederson, but we'll have to sort of really wait until then. And that's going to be the cheat sheet for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and the advice was helpful. Thank you guys so much for watching. As I said, as usual, thank you guys so much for the members who are supporting this channel financially. Roll the Hall of Fame, and see you guys in the next video.